Hey Dialectics, today we're going to be finishing my breakdown of Das Kapital. Today will be chapters 20 through the end of the book. If you have any questions about anything that I've gone over in these three videos, just like I said, put them in the comments, and if there's enough questions, I'll make a video answering all the questions that I can. If you like these videos, hit like, subscribe, all that good stuff. Check out my Patreon, all that good jazz. On to chapter 21, peace wages. Basically, you get paid per thing you do so that you'll work yourself to death. After examining time wages, Marx goes into the difference between time wages and peace wages and how both are exploitative, but peace wages might actually be worse. Peace wages equals getting paid per item, per task, or per unit. So you don't get paid per time you're there, you get paid like per shirt you make, or per widget you put in, or in today's world, per click you get on a video. So first off, what are peace wages? Time wages, you get paid for the amount of time you spend working, and peace wages, you get paid for how much you produce. Peace wages are just time wages in disguise. Even though you're paid per unit, the capitalist still calculates everything by time. They know how many shirts a worker can make in an hour, how much the shirt sells for, and how much they can get away with paying for each shirt to keep their profit as high as possible. So instead of paying you for your output, they still only pay enough to cover what your costs of survival are. It's just broken into smaller parts with pay by piece instead of pay by time. Simple example, a worker can make 10 shirts in an hour, but the boss sets the price at $1 per shirt, so $10 per day. But the value you produce might be more like 50. So just like with time wages, you only get back what's needed to reproduce your labor power, to keep you showing up and you reproducing labor power. The rest is unpaid surplus value, just split into little tiny pieces. The reason that capitalists love piecework is because piece wages are extra sneaky. They make workers compete with one another, so you'll try to produce more shirts than the guy next to you. They push all workers to self-exploit themselves. If I just make 2 more shirts, then I can actually feed my kids this week. They remove the need for constant supervision, because if I know you're going to work as fast as you can, I don't need to hire a manager to make sure and a supervisor to make sure you're doing this. It's exploitation that is twisted to make it feel like freedom. You choose to work until you exhaust yourself to death. The reason that piecework is able to increase exploitation, when you're paid per piece, there's always pressure to work longer hours, because if you stay just a longer, you can produce more shirts. You can work faster if you can just get in 1 or 2 more shirts an hour, and you'll accept lower rates to stay competitive. If the guy next to you says he'll produce shirts for 90 cents per shirt and you're working for $1 per shirt, guess who the capitalist is going to hire? Any productivity that increases the amount of shirts you can make goes straight to the capitalist. If all of a sudden there's a machine invented that makes it to where now you can produce twice as many shirts per hour, you don't all of a sudden get paid per shirt per extra shirt per hour. They just cut the prices of each shirt they were going to pay you to make, so you still get exploited. The more machines they bring in, the more exploited you will get. Piecework splits workers into 2 groups. It makes high performers who earn the most, but they burn themselves out, and low performers who earn less per hour, but they feel like failures all the time because they can't keep up with the high performing guy who's going to burn himself out and hate his life the entire time. Piecework creates a false sense of individual control, illusions of merit-based fairness, and breaks down worker solidarity. Why would you organize with the guy next to you if you're actually competing with how fast you can produce? It breaks labor unions and things like that. And that's basically chapter 21. Let's go to chapter 22. Okay, so in chapter 22 is national difference of wages, or why a worker in one country makes $20 an hour and a worker in another country makes $2 an hour, but they're doing the same work, like construction or something. If workers everywhere are exploited under capitalism, why do wages differ so much between the countries? What you need to understand is that labor power has a price tag based on local conditions. Remember, wages equal the value of labor power equals what it costs to keep a worker alive and able to work. It's just what it costs to keep you alive in your local area. That cost depends on the cost of food, housing, and fuel, etc., cultural standards of living, climate and geography, infrastructure and level of development, and local class struggles. Have the workers fought for better rights than in other countries? So in richer countries, the cost of keeping a worker alive is a lot higher. That means the wages are higher, but not because the worker is more valuable. It's just because the conditions to keep the worker alive cost more. Higher wages does not equal less exploitation. Capitalists in richer countries often pay more, but they also get more output from each worker due to better technology, more intense work pace, and longer and more productive workdays. So even if wages are higher, the surplus value is often quite a bit greater, which means more profit for the capitalist. A worker in Germany might make 5 times as much money as a worker in Bangladesh, but produce 10 times the value. That means more exploitation, not less. Capitalist benefits from the wage gap between countries. Marx shows that the global difference in wages aren't a flaw, they're a feature of capitalism. Capitalism flows to where the labor is the cheapest. That's where they'll send the capital. Bosses threaten workers in higher wage countries with offshoring or automation. Workers in low wage countries are used to undercut wage demands elsewhere in the world. They'll threaten to move your job to another country so that you won't ask for a raise as much. It's divide and conquer on a global scale. It pits workers against each other instead of against capital, where we should be all mad. Wages reflect power, not just productivity. So countries with strong unions, a history of labor resistance, and better labor laws can force capitalists to pay more, not because they're more skilled, but just because they've fought and won better conditions. Meanwhile, in colonized or developing countries, centuries of exploitation keep wages artificially low, even if the workers are just as productive. The capitalist is able to look globally with his capital, but the workers are trapped in their local conditions. Capitalists can move their money, shift factories, shop around the world for the cheapest labor, but workers are stuck. They're stuck where they live, where their papers will allow them to go, and in economies they didn't design and don't really take part in. This mobility imbalance lets capital squeeze more out of workers everywhere. That's basically chapter 22. Let's do the next one. Okay, now we're going to go on to chapter 23, simple reproduction. Why capitalism keeps going and why it needs you to stay just broke enough to survive and keep working, but never get enough to where you can get out of the system. What is simple reproduction? Simple reproduction means the capitalist takes the surplus value of what they've extracted from workers and spends it all on themselves, on luxury, yachts, and going to space today. No reinvestment in the community, no growth, just repeating the cycle at the same scale. It's like hitting save and reload on the capitalist system every year. The same exploitation just repeats, just as it is. Workers must keep selling themselves. In order for this cycle to work, workers have to keep showing up, keep selling their labor, keep reproducing the next generation of workers. But they can't do this if they pay you enough to escape. That's the entire point of it, is to keep you in the system. The wages must stay low enough to keep you working, but high enough to keep you and your children alive so that they can produce the next generation of workers. The reproduction of labor power. Capital doesn't just reproduce products. It reproduces the conditions that allow exploitation. Workers stay dependent on wages. Education trains the next generation of workers. Social norms and ideology makes the system seem natural. The result, the workers is reborn every day as a seller of labor power, and they're never, ever paid enough to stop selling. Free labor that you can't escape. Under feudalism, you could legally leave your lord. Under capitalism, you're free, but only if you can afford not to work. In simple reproduction, capitalism preserves the labor supply. It does this by never letting workers build real wealth. You're always just poor enough to need the job again tomorrow. Capitalism is a loop. It's not a line. This chapter explains that capitalism doesn't finish with the sale of a product. It instead loops in on itself. Workers produce the goods. Capitalism sells them for profit, uses the profit to buy more labor power, and starts the process again. As long as the workers keep needing wages, the loop can never end. That's why they only pay you enough to just barely survive. And that's why they don't care about you once you stop working. It's like, imagine you make $100 a day, but it costs you $100 to live. You work, you get paid, you survive, you repeat, you do it again, you do it again, you do it again. Takeaway of this entire chapter is capitalism doesn't just exploit you once. It recreates the conditions of your exploitation every single day. That's basically chapter 23. Let's keep going. Okay, in chapter 24 is the conversion of surplus value into capital, or how the rich get richer using your previously exploited labor to buy more things to exploit your labor more. They goes from simple reproduction to expanded reproduction. In chapter 23, we saw simple reproduction where the surplus value is just spent on like wine and yachts and, going to space. But in expanded reproduction, the capitalist does something even more dangerous. They take the surplus value from your unpaid labor and reinvest it into the business to grow it. This creates a snowball effect. More capital equals more labor power bought equals more surplus value, which they use to buy more capital, which can buy more surplus labor. This is what's called capital accumulation. Capital accumulation is when the capitalist uses his profit or his surplus value to hire more workers, buy more machines, or expand production. That means that the exploitation gets bigger. Not just continued, but it's actually scaled up to a larger level. A simple example, let's say a boss makes $100 in surplus value. Instead of buying a fancy coat, he hires another worker, buys better tools, doubles his factory's output. Now he makes $200 in surplus value in the next cycle. The laborers don't get any of that. Repeat this over years, always increasing your surplus value every cycle, and eventually you become Elon Musk. Workers produce the very capital that then ends up controlling them. This is Marx's most brutal insight in this entire chapter. The surplus value created by workers becomes the capital used to control more work. It's not just that you're being exploited, it's that your exploitation today is funding the exploitation of you and your children tomorrow. It's seriously a feedback loop of an endless cycle. You work, which generates surplus value. The boss reinvests that surplus value, buys more labor and more machines. Now you and others must work harder and longer to generate even more surplus value for the boss. And then he repeats that same system over and over and over again. The wages stays the same, but the capitalist keeps growing his capital and his control. You keep selling your labor power, get paid just enough to survive, and stay in perpetual dependency on the capitalist system. Even as production and technology advances and markets expand, the rich get richer, but the workers' lives basically stay the same. The working conditions basically haven't changed in 100 years. They're not that different, but you actually do. Machines replace people, but only to help exploitation. Capitalists use surplus value to buy machines, which makes workers much more productive. But instead of easing the work, this leads to fewer jobs, lower wages, and a faster output at the work. Machines don't free workers. They intensify exploitation. Technology becomes a tool of domination when it should be a tool of liberation. But they never cut your hours by how much faster the machine makes things produced. They just take the extra and give it to the capitalist, and they fire a bunch of workers. The bigger the capital, the smaller the worker. The more the capitalist accumulates, the less individual power each individual worker has. They are more dependent on the system. They're much more replaceable because your job is smaller and simpler to do. And the gap between rich and poor gets bigger and bigger. This isn't an accident. This is designed into the system. In this chapter, Marx basically lays down how capital doesn't just steal your time. It uses your stolen time to build a machine that will steal even more of your time from you, your kids, and your grandkids. The simplest example I can think of for this would be like, you work 8 hours, you create $400 of value, you get paid $100. That means your boss has $300 of surplus value. And then he uses that to expand the factory. Next month, you're working harder, faster to keep up with the machines for the same $100. But now your boss is making $600 in surplus value. Because of the unpaid labor you had last month, he's using that to increase his surplus value, and he's going to do it again and again. And that's basically chapter 24. Let's go to chapter 25. Okay, let's do it. Chapter 25, the general law of capitalist accumulation. Why the rich keep getting richer, the poor stay poor, and the middle class keeps doing all the work. This chapter is massive. Marx zooms out from individual factories and wage formulas to show how the accumulation of capital reshapes all of society. Marx's general law of capitalist accumulation is simple. The more capital accumulates, the worse the conditions of the working class becomes. Even if some workers get raises or the economy grows, Marx says the relative position of the workers always declines. Capital becomes more powerful, labor becomes more dependent, and inequality is baked into the system. Capital needs poverty to function. As capital grows, it doesn't lift everyone up. Instead, it creates a reserve army of labor, a pool of people who are either unemployed, underemployed, desperate for work, or willing to work for less. This army of underemployed people lets capitalists keep wages low, replace rebellious workers, break up unions, and increase competition amongst workers. Your job isn't secure because there's always somebody hungrier willing to do your job for a little less. Marx calls this the hidden army of capitalism. He calls it the law of population. Under capitalism, the system always produces more workers than it needs. This isn't because people are lazy or bad at budgeting. It's because capital deliberately keeps a section of the population in poverty. They need the reserve army divided into the floating, the recently unemployed, latent, people in rural or marginalized areas, stagnant workers in temporary low-paying jobs, and the disabled and destitute, people who are actually unable to physically work. Because each group serves as a discipline to the rest. If you don't keep grinding away, you're going to end up as one of those other people, and you don't want that. There's always a relative surplus population. Even when the economy grows, not everyone benefits. In fact, growth often makes inequality worse because automation and machines replace jobs. Larger firms crush the smaller firm. Labor becomes more disposable and therefore you're easier to replace at your job. This leads to a relative surplus population, a group of people who can't find steady work even when they're willing. Unemployment isn't a glitch in capitalism. It's built into the system. It's a feature of capitalism. It's there on purpose. Capital grows. Rich people get richer, and workers grow weaker and lose their uniting power because they get us fighting amongst ourselves. The richer a capitalist becomes, the more power they can hold over workers, the more they can automate, outsource, and relocate resources and labor, the more they can shape laws and policy and the media and by the government. And meanwhile, workers are pushed into harder, faster, and more insecure jobs. They lose their leverage and their bargaining power, and they have fewer alternatives. Freedom under capitalism means freely choosing what master you serve, but you'll never make enough to not have to serve a master. Even rising wages don't mean that you're liberated. Sometimes workers do win higher wages, especially if there's like a labor strike during a labor shortage or they're actually successful at organizing. But Marx warns that even wages rising slightly always ends up benefiting capital because capital always will outgrow the wages. So workers may feel a little better off, but they still are selling their labor. They still depend on the wages they're earned from the capitalists, and they still do not own the means of production. So capital's power grows relative to labor. Even in good times, the capitalists will get more than you every single time. The most simple example of what explained in this chapter is, imagine there's a factory where you make $100 a day. One day they buy a machine that does your job twice as fast and they lay off half the workers. Now you're too scared to speak up because there's 10 people outside the gate who will do your job for $70 a day. That's the system. It's not a part of capitalism that's like bad. That's part of the system. They do that on purpose. Capitalism is not a system of a balance. It's a system of expanding control and deepening inequality so that it's easier to control the workforce. And that's chapter 25. That's Karl Marx, Das Kapital. I hope I made it simple enough. Like I said, if you have any questions about anything, ask them down in the comments and I'll try to answer them. Have a great day, guys.